Sometimes the wrong message finds the person who was meant to read it all along. At 2:13 in the morning, the pediatric emergency room at Mercy General Hospital glowed with the cold blue light of exhaustion. The fluorescent panels above buzzed softly like tired insects trapped behind plastic. Nurses moved through the hallway with paper cups of stale coffee in their hands, their sneakers squeaking against polished linoleum floors that smelled faintly of bleach and hand sanitizer. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted silently over downtown Chicago, coating the streets in pale silver, while ambulances painted the darkness red every few minutes with spinning lights. Claire Bennett sat alone in a hard plastic chair beside her son's hospital bed, still wearing the navy blue scrubs from her night shift. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy knot that had nearly fallen apart, and dark circles rested under eyes too young to look so tired. 8-year-old Noah slept beneath a thin hospital blanket, his cheeks flushed with fever while a heart monitor beeped steadily beside him. Across the room, Ethan slept curled on 2 chairs pushed together, clutching an old stuffed dinosaur missing one button eye. Claire looked at them both and felt her chest tighten with the kind of loneliness that made a room full of people feel empty. She rubbed her face with trembling hands before glancing down at the phone resting in her lap. The screen was cracked near the corner. Her rent was late. Her car heater barely worked. And tomorrow morning, she still had to clock in for another 12-hour shift because life did not stop being expensive just because someone was exhausted. She unlocked the phone and opened an old contact she had never been able to delete. Daniel. The name alone made her throat ache. 8 years ago, Daniel Hayes had been the kind of man who made cheap apartments feel warm and impossible futures feel survivable. Then one rainy night outside Boston, a car accident had erased him from the world before he ever knew Claire was pregnant. Some nights, when the silence became too heavy, Claire still texted his old number. She never expected an answer. It was simply the only place left to put her grief. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard while Noah shifted weakly in his sleep. Then slowly, she typed, "I don't know how to raise the twins without you anymore." She stared at the message for several seconds before hitting send. Usually the text disappeared into emptiness. Usually there was comfort in that. But tonight was different. 3 tiny words suddenly appeared beneath the message. Delivered. Claire froze. Her heartbeat stumbled hard against her ribs. She blinked once, then twice, convinced exhaustion was making her hallucinate. But the word remained there, glowing on the screen like something alive. Delivered. Her breath caught in her throat. Somewhere nearly 900 miles away, inside a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, billionaire Damian Carlisle sat alone beside floor-to-ceiling windows as snow fell quietly over Central Park. The city glittered beneath him like broken diamonds scattered across black velvet. A half-finished glass of bourbon rested near his hand, while financial reports lay untouched across a marble table. His expensive apartment was silent except for the soft crackling of a fireplace and the faint hum of Manhattan traffic 40 stories below. Then his new phone vibrated once against the table. Damien glanced down absently, expecting another corporate message from Tokyo or London. But when he opened the text, his expression changed instantly. His eyes locked onto one word. Twins. The glass slipped slightly in his hand. Because 8 years ago, his younger twin brother vanished from the Carlisle family forever after falling in love with a woman nobody in their world approved of. And for the first time in years, Damian Carlisle felt something colder than grief move slowly down his spine. Damian Carlisle did not believe in coincidences. Men like him built billion-dollar companies by trusting patterns, numbers, and instinct, not fate. Yet as he stood motionless beside the glass windows of his Manhattan penthouse, the phone in his hand suddenly felt heavier than the empire he owned beneath him. Snow drifted slowly past the skyline outside, softening the sharp towers of the city into pale shadows, but inside the penthouse everything remained cold and precise. Italian marble floors reflected the amber glow of recessed lighting. A fire crackled quietly beneath a massive oil painting worth more than most homes in America. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood, leather, and expensive bourbon. It was the kind of place magazines called extraordinary. But tonight it felt painfully empty. Damien read the message again. "I do not know how to raise the twins without you anymore." His jaw tightened slightly. 8 years. 8 long years since Daniel Carlisle disappeared from the family forever. His younger twin brother had once been the light inside every room he entered. Daniel laughed louder, loved harder, and cared less about money than anyone born into the Carlisle dynasty ever should have. Their father hated that about him. Damien admired it in silence. Then one day Daniel vanished after a bitter argument with the family board. Weeks later came the phone call about the accident outside Boston. Wet roads. Midnight rain. No survivors. Damien had buried his brother beside their mother under a gray November sky, while reporters circled the cemetery gates like vultures. And now, somehow, a stranger was texting Daniel's old number talking about twins. Damien walked slowly toward the fireplace, his polished shoes silent against the marble floor. He lowered himself into a chair and stared into the flames while memories he had spent years suppressing began clawing back to the surface. He remembered Daniel sitting barefoot on the hood of an old pickup truck one summer night in Cape Cod, grinning like life had never hurt him once. "You ever think maybe we were born into the wrong family?" Daniel had joked while eating cheap diner fries from a paper bag. Damien had rolled his eyes back then. But now the memory landed differently. Because Daniel had disappeared right after mentioning someone he refused to name. A woman. Someone he loved enough to walk away from billions for. Damien reached for his phone again and pressed a button. Within seconds, his head of security answered. "Sir, I need information on a woman," Damien said quietly. "Name?" Damien looked back at the message. "Claire Bennett." There was a brief silence on the line. "Understood. Anything specific?" Damien's gaze drifted toward the snow-covered skyline. "Everything." Across Chicago, Claire sat frozen in the hospital chair staring at her own phone like it had become dangerous. She checked the number 3 separate times. Same area code. Same digits she had memorized years ago. Her stomach twisted painfully. Maybe someone recycled the number. Maybe it belonged to a stranger now. Maybe she had just poured her grief into the hands of someone who would laugh at her. A soft cough pulled her attention back toward Noah's bed. The fever had finally started breaking. Claire stood carefully and brushed damp blonde hair away from his forehead with trembling fingers. She was so tired her bones ached. Around her, the emergency room moved in exhausted silence. A janitor pushed a mop bucket slowly down the hallway while televisions mounted near the ceiling played muted late-night news no one watched. Then her phone vibrated. Claire looked down instinctively. Unknown number. Her pulse quickened. For several seconds, she could not breathe. Finally, she opened the message. "Where are the twins now?" Claire stared at the message until the words began to blur together on the cracked screen. "Where are the twins now?" The question felt wrong somehow, too direct, too personal for a stranger who had supposedly inherited an old phone number. Her fingers tightened around the device while unease spread slowly through her chest. Around her, the emergency room carried on with the quiet rhythm of people too tired to notice each other. Somewhere down the hallway, a baby cried briefly before falling silent again. An exhausted doctor rubbed his eyes near the nurse's station while the smell of burnt coffee drifted through the air. Claire looked toward Noah sleeping beneath the pale blue hospital blanket and lowered the brightness on her phone instinctively, as if protecting the boys from words they could not even read. For a moment, she considered ignoring the message completely. That would have been the smart thing to do. But grief had a strange way of making people reckless at 2 in the morning. Slowly, she typed back. "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then returned again. Finally, the answer came. "My name is Damien Carlisle. I think we need to speak in person." Claire frowned at the name. Carlisle. Something about it sounded familiar, the kind of name people saw engraved on hospital wings and university buildings. Before she could respond, another message arrived. Did the twins' father ever mention the Carlisle family? Claire felt the air leave her lungs. Her eyes widened slightly as memories she had buried years ago suddenly rose back to the surface. Daniel never liked talking about his family. Whenever she asked about his childhood, his expression would darken just enough to make her stop pushing. He always changed the subject with a smile afterward, kissing her forehead and promising that one day they would have a different life somewhere quieter. Claire remembered cheap pizza boxes on tiny apartment floors. Long drives through Boston at midnight with the windows cracked open. Daniel laughing while old rock songs played through a broken truck radio. He had been kind in ways the world rarely rewarded. The kind of man who gave his winter coat to strangers without hesitation and carried grocery bags for elderly neighbors before carrying his own upstairs. But there had always been something hidden behind his eyes. Something unfinished. Claire swallowed hard and typed carefully. No, he never talked about them. In Manhattan, Damien sat motionless while the fire reflected softly across the sharp angles of his face. His security team had already begun compiling information on Claire Bennett. Age 29. Registered nurse. Widowed status unofficial. 2 sons, Ethan and Noah Bennett. Chicago residency for the past 7 years. No criminal history. No lawsuits. No suspicious financial activity. Nothing about her life suggested manipulation or greed. If anything, the report painted the picture of someone barely keeping herself afloat. Damien leaned back slowly in the leather chair, staring at the photographs now appearing on the secure tablet beside him. Grainy images taken from social media showed Claire holding 2 blonde boys at a public park during summer. In one photo, Ethan sat on her shoulders laughing while Noah held her hand beside a melting ice cream cart. Damien's chest tightened unexpectedly. The boys looked familiar, not because of wealth or status, because one of them had Daniel's smile. The same crooked grin that used to drive their father insane during board meetings. Damien stood abruptly and walked toward the windows again. Below him, Manhattan glittered endlessly, alive with ambition and loneliness. He suddenly remembered the final argument he ever had with Daniel. One day you are going to regret choosing money over people, Daniel had said quietly before walking out of the Carlisle estate forever. Damien had not answered then. Tonight, for the first time in years, he realized his brother might have been right. Back in Chicago, Claire looked down as Noah stirred weakly beneath the blanket. His small hand reached sleepily toward her without opening his eyes. She immediately took it. Then her phone vibrated once more. Claire, the new message read, I am sending a car for you and the boys in the morning. Please do not be afraid. Morning arrived slowly over Chicago beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Snowmelt dripped from fire escapes outside Mercy General Hospital, while exhausted commuters shuffled through slush-covered sidewalks, clutching paper coffee cups against the bitter wind. Claire Bennett stepped carefully through the sliding hospital doors with Noah bundled against her side and Ethan holding tightly onto her hand. The boys looked small beneath oversized winter coats bought one size too big so they would last another year. Claire barely slept at all after the messages. Every hour, she had stared at her phone wondering whether she had made a terrible mistake responding to a stranger connected somehow to Daniel's past. Yet deep down, beneath the fear and exhaustion, another feeling had begun growing quietly inside her. Hope. Dangerous, impossible hope. A gust of icy wind swept through the street as they reached the curb. Then Ethan suddenly stopped walking. Mom, he whispered softly. Claire followed his gaze and froze. Parked beside the cracked sidewalk was a long black limousine gleaming beneath the gray morning light like something that belonged in another universe entirely. Its polished surface reflected the dirty snowbanks and aging apartment buildings surrounding it with almost painful contrast. People nearby slowed to stare openly. A man walking his dog paused mid-step. 2 nurses leaving their shift glanced toward Claire with visible confusion before whispering to each other. The driver stepped out wearing a charcoal coat and black leather gloves. He moved with the calm precision of someone trained never to rush. Ms. Bennett, he asked politely. Claire instinctively tightened her grip on Ethan's hand. Yes. The driver nodded once. Mr. Carlisle sent me to bring you and your children somewhere safe. Claire's pulse quickened immediately. Safe. The word unsettled her more than if he had said luxury or comfort. Because safe implied danger. I think there has been a misunderstanding, Claire replied carefully. We are fine. The driver reached into his coat slowly and handed her a cream-colored envelope sealed with a silver emblem. Claire hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single handwritten note in dark ink. Claire, I know this feels strange, but if Daniel were here, he would ask me to help you. Please trust me for 1 hour. Damien. Claire stared at the handwriting while memories crashed against her chest unexpectedly. Daniel used to write notes exactly like this. Short, honest, direct. Her eyes drifted toward the limousine again. Through the tinted windows, she could see warm interior lights glowing softly against dark leather seats. Ethan tugged gently at her sleeve. Mom, he whispered, are we in trouble? Claire immediately knelt in front of him despite the freezing pavement soaking through her jeans. She brushed snowflakes from his blonde hair and forced a small, reassuring smile. No, baby. Nobody is in trouble. Noah looked up sleepily from her side. Then why is there a movie star car here? Claire almost laughed despite herself. Almost. Before she could answer, an older woman smoking near the hospital entrance muttered loudly enough to hear. Rich people only show up when they want something. The words landed harder than Claire expected because part of her feared they were true. Her entire life had taught her that powerful people rarely noticed women like her unless there was a reason. Still, something about Damien's messages felt different. There had been no arrogance in them. No pity. Only urgency wrapped carefully around grief. The driver opened the limousine door quietly. Warm air spilled into the freezing street, carrying the faint scent of leather and cedarwood. Ethan's eyes widened. Noah coughed weakly against Claire's shoulder. She looked down at her sons, then back at the envelope trembling slightly in her hand. Finally, she exhaled slowly. 1 hour, she whispered to herself more than anyone else. Then Claire Bennett stepped into the limousine with her children, unaware that across Manhattan, Damien Carlyle stood beside his penthouse window watching the snow fall while holding an old photograph of his brother and shaking hands. The limousine moved silently through downtown Chicago like a black shadow gliding across dirty winter streets. Inside, warmth wrapped around Claire and the boys in a way that felt almost unreal after years of drafty apartments and broken radiators. Soft amber lights glowed beneath polished wood panels, while the seats smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Ethan sat pressed against the window in complete fascination, his breath fogging the glass as snow-covered buildings passed outside. Noah leaned sleepily against Claire's shoulder beneath a thick wool blanket the driver had quietly offered without being asked. Claire herself sat stiffly near the edge of the seat, one hand resting protectively across Noah's back, while the other still held Damien's handwritten note. Every instinct she had built over years of struggling alone told her to stay cautious. Rich men did not enter the lives of women like her without consequences attached. Yet nothing about this morning made sense anymore. 20 minutes earlier, she had been worrying about overdue electric bills and cafeteria coffee at the hospital. Now she was riding through Chicago in a vehicle worth more than everything she owned combined. The city blurred. Outside beneath gray skies and melting snowbanks. They passed luxury hotels with gold-trimmed awnings, crowded bus stops filled with shivering commuters, and coffee shops glowing warmly against the cold morning. Claire noticed how differently people looked at the limousine. Some stared openly with envy, others with suspicion. It reminded her how money changed the way the world treated people before they even spoke. Ethan suddenly turned from the window. "Mom," he asked softly, "is this guy famous?" Claire hesitated. "I do not know." The driver glanced briefly through the rearview mirror before speaking for the first time since they left the hospital. "Mr. Carlyle prefers privacy." Ethan considered that seriously. "That means yes." For the first time all morning, Noah gave a weak little laugh against Claire's shoulder. The sound eased something inside her chest. Then the limousine slowed unexpectedly before turning beneath a massive stone archway guarded by iron gates taller than the apartment building where Claire lived. Her breath caught immediately. Beyond the gates stretched a private estate hidden in the center of the city like another world entirely. Snow-covered, perfectly trimmed hedges, while fountains stood frozen beneath white marble statues. The driveway curved slowly toward an enormous gray mansion lined with towering windows that reflected the cloudy winter sky. Claire stared silently. She had seen places like this only in magazines left behind in hospital waiting rooms. The driver opened her door carefully once they stopped beneath the covered entrance. Cold air rushed inside immediately. "We are here, Miss Bennett." Claire stepped out slowly with Noah, while Ethan looked around wide-eyed at everything. The front doors opened before they even reached the steps. A woman in her 60s greeted them warmly inside the grand foyer. "Good morning," she said gently. "I am Evelyn. Mr. Carlyle is waiting for you upstairs." The mansion felt impossibly quiet. Their footsteps echoed softly across marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the chandeliers hanging overhead like frozen waterfalls made of crystal. Claire noticed fresh white roses arranged near the staircase and the faint scent of burning cedarwood drifting through the air. Wealth lived differently here. Quietly, effortlessly, not flashy like television, just permanent. Ethan squeezed her hand tighter. "Mom," he whispered carefully. This place feels like a castle. Claire nodded faintly because she did not trust her voice anymore. Then they reached the top of the staircase. At the end of a long hallway lined with oil paintings stood a tall man beside a window overlooking the snowy gardens below. Dark tailored suit, silver watch, hands clasped tightly behind his back. He looked older than Daniel had been, sharper somehow, as if grief itself had carved clean edges into him over time. Slowly, the man turned around. Claire stopped breathing for half a second, because standing across the room was a face that looked painfully, impossibly familiar. Ethan looked up at her in confusion before whispering the words that froze the entire room. "Mom, why does he look exactly like Dad?" The room fell completely silent after Ethan's question, as if even the mansion itself had stopped breathing. Snow drifted slowly outside the towering windows while the fire crackled faintly somewhere down the hall, but inside that enormous room no one moved for several long seconds. Damien Carlyle stared at the little boy standing beside Claire, and something inside him shifted in a way he had not felt in years. Ethan had Daniel's eyes. Not just the color, the expression. Curious, fearless, painfully sincere. It hit Damien harder than grief ever had, because grief at least prepared you for absence. This felt like presence returning without warning. Claire instinctively placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder while Noah held tightly onto her coat sleeve, still pale from the fever. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Up close, the resemblance between Damien and Daniel was almost unbearable. The same sharp jawline, the same storm-gray eyes. But where Daniel had carried warmth like sunlight, Damien carried something colder. Loneliness polished into elegance. Damien took one slow breath before finally speaking. "I am Damien Carlyle," he said quietly. His voice was calm, controlled, but Claire noticed the slight strain beneath it immediately. "Daniel was my brother." Claire felt her knees weaken for half a second. Brother. The word echoed through years of unanswered questions and unfinished grief. Daniel had never told her his last name. Never once. Back then she assumed it was because he came from money and wanted distance from it. Now standing inside this mansion, she realized she had never truly understood how much money. Ethan looked between them carefully. "You are twins too." Damien's expression softened slightly at the question. "Yes," he answered. "We were." Noah looked up from Claire's side, studying Damien with sleepy blue eyes. "Mom says Dad used to hate wearing matching clothes." For the first time since Claire entered the mansion, the corner of Damien's mouth lifted faintly. That sounds exactly like him. The tension in the room shifted just enough for everyone to breathe again. Evelyn quietly appeared carrying a tray of hot chocolate and tea before disappearing with the grace of someone who understood when silence mattered more than conversation. Claire wrapped trembling hands around the warm teacup placed in front of her while the boys sat together on an enormous cream-colored sofa that probably cost more than her yearly salary. Ethan cautiously sipped hot chocolate beneath a thick knit blanket while Noah slowly relaxed against the cushions. Damien remained standing near the fireplace for another moment, studying them carefully. Not with suspicion, with recognition. Finally, he walked toward a long walnut cabinet near the wall and opened a drawer slowly. When he turned back around, an old photograph rested in his hand. "I think you should see this," he said softly. Claire accepted the picture with unsteady fingers. Her breath caught instantly. It was Daniel, younger, smiling broadly beneath summer sunlight with one arm thrown around Damien's shoulders beside a sailboat docked somewhere beautiful and expensive. The resemblance was undeniable. Ethan leaned closer to look. "That is Dad," he whispered immediately. Noah pointed toward Damien in the photograph. "And that is you." Damien nodded once. Claire stared down at the image while emotions she had buried for nearly a decade rose painfully into her chest. She remembered Daniel telling her once that he had a brother he missed terribly. At the time she thought he meant emotionally distant. She never imagined entire worlds separated them. "Why did he never tell me?" Claire asked quietly before she could stop herself. Damien's eyes lowered briefly toward the firelight reflecting across the marble floor. "Because my family would have tried to take him away from you." Claire looked up sharply. Damien met her gaze fully now, and for the first time the billionaire standing before her no longer seemed intimidating. He looked exhausted, like a man carrying guilt too heavy to hide anymore. Daniel left this house because he was tired of living inside a world where money mattered more than people, Damien admitted softly. and I was too much of a coward to go with him. The fire cracked sharply in the silence that followed. Then Noah asked the question nobody in the room was ready for. "If you are our uncle," he whispered carefully, "why were you never with Dad when he died?" Noah's question settled over the room with the weight of something painfully honest, the kind of truth only children could ask without cruelty. The firelight flickered softly across the marble walls while snow continued falling outside the tall windows in slow white spirals. Damien stood motionless near the fireplace, and for the first time since Claire met him, the carefully controlled billionaire facade cracked slightly around the edges. He lowered his eyes toward the old photograph still resting in Claire's hands. "Because I failed him," Damien answered quietly. The words were simple, but they carried years inside them. Ethan looked down at his hot chocolate while Noah leaned silently against Claire's side. Even the boys seemed to understand this was no longer just a conversation between strangers. Claire watched Damien carefully. Wealth usually protected people from looking vulnerable. Money bought polished answers, public relations teams, and rehearsed confidence. But none of those things seemed to help him now. Damien walked slowly toward the windows, overlooking the snowy gardens below. "Daniel and I were born 8 minutes apart," he said softly. "But our father spent our entire lives trying to turn us into different people." His reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. I obeyed. Daniel did not. Claire remained silent, letting him continue. Somewhere deep inside her, pieces of Daniel's old sadness were finally beginning to make sense. Damien clasped his hands tightly behind his back. "The Carlyle family does not survive on kindness," he admitted. "It survives on control, reputation, power." My father believed emotions made men weak. He let out a faint, humorless laugh. Daniel believed the opposite. Ethan listened carefully now, his young face serious beyond his years. Damien turned slightly toward them again. "When Daniel met you, Claire, everything changed for him. He stopped coming to board meetings, stopped caring about money. He talked about leaving Boston and buying a little house somewhere near the coast." Claire's breath caught painfully because Daniel had once described that exact dream to her while lying beside her in their tiny apartment with rain tapping softly against the windows. Damien's voice lowered further. "Our father found out." The warmth in the room suddenly felt colder. Claire instinctively tightened her arms around Noah. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Damien looked toward the fire again before answering. "My father gave Daniel a choice. The family, or the life he wanted with you." Claire already knew which one Daniel chose. Damien swallowed once before continuing. "The night before the accident, Daniel came here. We argued for almost 2 hours. His jaw tightened slightly with the memory. He asked me to leave with him, to walk away from everything." Silence stretched briefly between them. "But I stayed," Damien admitted. "I told myself responsibility mattered more." Claire looked down slowly while emotion burned behind her eyes. Because suddenly she could picture it perfectly. Daniel standing in this mansion years ago, begging his brother to choose people over power. Damien walked toward a small wooden desk near the fireplace and opened one of the drawers carefully. From inside, he removed a worn leather envelope tied with faded string. His fingers hesitated briefly before holding it out toward Claire. "These were found in Daniel's apartment after he died," he said quietly. "Letters he never mailed." Claire accepted the envelope with trembling hands. The paper felt old and fragile beneath her fingertips. Slowly she untied the string and unfolded the first letter. The moment she recognized Daniel's handwriting, tears blurred her vision instantly. "Claire," she read softly aloud, her voice trembling. "If you are reading this, it means I waited too long to come back for you." Ethan and Noah both looked up immediately. Claire pressed her hand against her mouth while reading further. "I know you are probably angry. You have every right to be. But I need you to know something before anything else. If we ever have children someday, I already know they will be the best thing I ever do in this world." Claire broke completely then. Tears slipped silently down her face while years of buried grief finally cracked open inside her chest. Across the room, Damien looked away toward the falling snow because guilt had suddenly become unbearable to watch. The mansion grew quieter as afternoon light faded across the snow-covered gardens outside. Gray winter clouds pressed low over the city while soft firelight flickered against polished marble walls, filling the enormous room with a warmth that somehow made the sadness inside it feel even heavier. Claire sat curled slightly into the corner of the cream-colored sofa with Daniel's unfinished letters resting carefully in her lap. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but she could not stop reading. Every page felt like hearing his voice again after years of silence. Ethan and Noah sat close beside her now, listening quietly while the fire crackled nearby. Across the room, Damien remained near the windows with a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand. He had spent years building companies worth billions of dollars, yet at this moment none of that power seemed useful against memory. Claire unfolded another letter slowly. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers. "I keep thinking about the twins," she read softly. "I know it sounds crazy because they are not even born yet, but I dream about them anyway. Two little boys running somewhere near the ocean. One brave, one thoughtful, both stubborn like their mother." Ethan glanced toward Noah immediately. "I am the brave one," he whispered seriously. Noah frowned. "You cried during math homework last week." For the first time all day, a small laugh escaped Claire before she could stop it. The sound filled the room unexpectedly, soft and fragile, but real. Damien looked over immediately. Something in his expression changed, hearing laughter inside the house again, as if the mansion itself had not heard that sound in years. Claire continued reading while tears threatened her voice again. "I am trying to fix things before I come back to you," Daniel had written. "I want our children to grow up in a life built on love instead of fear." Claire closed her eyes briefly. She finally understood now why Daniel had looked haunted during those last months together. He had been trying to protect them from a world she never even knew existed. Damien slowly crossed the room and lowered himself into the armchair opposite the sofa. "There is something else you should know," he said quietly. Claire looked up carefully. Damien rested his elbows against his knees, staring down into the firelight. "After Daniel died, my father erased him from the family completely." The words landed cold and sharp. Ethan frowned slightly. "Why?" Damien looked toward the boys, and Claire noticed how carefully he chose his next words. "Because some people care more about appearances than love." Noah tilted his head thoughtfully. "That sounds lonely." Damien's expression tightened faintly because the child had unknowingly described his entire adult life in one sentence. "It is," he admitted softly. Silence settled briefly between them again. Then Claire looked down at the letters in her lap. "Why are you helping us now?" she asked quietly. "After all these years?" Damien stared into the flames for several seconds before answering. "Because when I saw your message last night," he said slowly, "it felt like my brother was speaking to me one final time." Snow tapped softly against the windows as the room dimmed deeper into evening. Somewhere downstairs, clocks chimed the hour through the enormous house. Damien reached into his suit jacket carefully before pulling out a small silver key attached to an old faded keychain shaped like a lighthouse. Claire immediately recognized it. Her breath caught painfully. Daniel used to carry that exact keychain everywhere. Damien held it gently in his palm. "This was found in his apartment after the accident," he explained quietly. "We never knew what it opened." Claire stared at the lighthouse keychain while memory suddenly crashed into her chest. 8 years ago, during one of their late-night drives along the Massachusetts coast, Daniel had once pointed toward a tiny blue cottage near the ocean cliffs. He had smiled and said, "One day I am going to take you there when everything finally settles down." Claire looked up slowly, stunned. "The cottage," she whispered. Damien frowned slightly. "What cottage?" Claire's eyes filled again as realization spread through her. "Daniel bought us a house." 3 weeks later, the Atlantic Ocean rolled endlessly beneath a pale spring sky, while waves crashed softly against the rocky cliffs outside a small blue cottage overlooking the Massachusetts coast. The house was modest by every Carlisle standard. White wooden shutters, a wraparound porch weathered by salt air, wild grass bending in the wind near the edge of the cliffs. But to Claire, it felt more valuable than every marble hallway inside Damien's mansion combined, because this place carried Daniel's unfinished dream inside its walls. Ethan and Noah raced across the backyard laughing beneath the afternoon sunlight, their sneakers kicking up damp grass while seagulls circled overhead. Their laughter drifted through the open kitchen windows, like music returning to a silent house. Claire stood at the sink watching them with tears quietly gathering in her eyes again, though these tears no longer came from exhaustion or grief alone. They came from finally understanding that Daniel had never planned to leave them behind. He had been trying to find his way back. The old lighthouse. He had opened the front door exactly as Claire remembered. Inside the cottage, they found unopened boxes of children's books, hand-painted bedroom walls still unfinished, and a faded envelope resting carefully inside the kitchen drawer. Daniel's handwriting covered the front. For our family. Claire had cried so hard reading it that morning she could barely breathe. Damien stood outside near the cliffside fence with his hands tucked into the pockets of a dark wool coat, while ocean wind moved through his silver-streaked hair. He looked different here somehow. Smaller than the empire he came from. More human beneath the open sky. Since that first morning in Chicago, something inside him had slowly begun changing. He no longer disappeared behind assistants and board meetings every hour of the day. Instead, he spent mornings helping Noah build model sailboats and afternoons listening to Ethan explain dinosaur facts with absolute seriousness. The boys had stopped calling him Mr. Carlisle after the second day. Now they simply called him Uncle Damien. The title seemed to heal something invisible inside him every time he heard it. Claire stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of coffee while the salty wind curled softly around her blonde hair. Damien accepted one quietly. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the twins run along the grass beneath the pale gold sunlight. Finally, Damien broke the silence. Daniel would have loved this place, he said softly. Claire smiled faintly toward the boys. He already did. The ocean crashed gently below the cliffs. Somewhere behind them, the old cottage creaked warmly in the wind like a home waking up after years asleep. Damien looked down at the coffee in his hands before speaking again. I spent most of my life believing success meant protecting the Carlisle name, he admitted quietly. But Daniel understood something I did not. Claire glanced toward him. Damien watched Ethan helping Noah climb onto a driftwood log near the shoreline. None of this matters if there is nobody to share it with. Claire felt the truth of those words settle softly between them. One mistaken message had unraveled years of silence, grief, and loneliness in a single night. Yet somehow, instead of destroying them, the truth had stitched together pieces of a broken family that never knew they still belonged to one another. Ethan suddenly waved excitedly from the beach below. Mom, Uncle Damien, come see this. Noah held up a smooth white seashell proudly beside him while waves curled around their boots. Damien laughed quietly under his breath before heading down the wooden steps toward the shore. Claire remained on the porch for one last moment, looking out at the ocean Daniel once dreamed of bringing them to. The wind carried the sound of the twins laughing together below, bright and alive against the endless sea. Claire closed her eyes briefly and smiled through tears because for the first time in years, the future no longer felt frightening. It felt like home. And somewhere beyond the crashing waves and fading winter memories, it almost felt as though Daniel had finally found his way back to them after all.